¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos.
Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for Foro de la Cultura for organizing this event. This is the third one here in Madrid. Tomorrow this is going on in Valladolid, and Philipp has an appointment tomorrow in Valladolid. And thank you also to Fundación Telefónica for hosting this event. This is part of the initiative Rethinking Tomorrow, and this chat today starts from a premise that is the world that our children will inherit. I have to admit that I feel like a student trying to learn instead of a journalist. But on the one hand, we have Máriam Martínez Bascuñán, who is a professor of politics in the University Autónoma of Madrid. She is also writing in El País newspaper. And also we have Philipp Blom. He's a historian. He has he has studied in Oxford and in Vienna, and he has managed to explain in a very easy to understand way very difficult things. He is a historian, but he has the writing of the best journalists and writers. I'm sure that you must have read many of his books, like Años de Vértigo, or What Is at Stake, or Fracture, Life and Culture in the West, etc. We are going to talk about the future, but we need to look first into the immediate present, especially when we are hearing rumors about war in the east of Europe. This is probably the most dangerous times after the end of the Cold War. Margaret Macmillan says that sometimes a little sparkle is enough to start a fire. I don't know if we're still at the point where we can prevent this event from happening. What can the Western world do to stop this from happening?
To stop the war in Ukraine, or what? Sorry, difficult to understand.
Para parar la guerra en Ucrania, no, simplemente
to stop the war in Ukraine. I mean, just to avoid that shock. We are seeing some kind of a narrative between Washington and Moscow. Are we going towards an invasion, towards a war? Are we living, for example, a John le Carré novel or something like that?
Good evening.
Just to get started, in a light way.
And I'm very glad to be here. And thank you to the Fundación Telefónica for having me. Look, you would have to ask a strategic scientist or somebody who really knows about this. But I think people in the West often underestimate how big the difference in experience and outlook is between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Eastern Europe hasn't had a 1968. Eastern Europe has had, most states in Eastern Europe have had largely an experience of power as oppression. They have not lived for democracies or not lived in democracies for long. And therefore their approach to the West and to its promises, and also incidentally they got the worst of neoliberalism because they were unlucky enough that the Berlin Wall fell at the time when neoliberalism was at its height, and everything had to be privatized, and the states had to be crippled and amputated, and so they've really had a bad deal out of this. And they're very, very distrustful of the West and the West's intentions and interests towards them. It is also true, apparently, that they were given assurances that NATO would not expand into the East, and they're very afraid because Russia, to be reasonably comfortable, needs buffer states between Western Europe, and that has been their strategic doctrine. So I think that may help a little bit to understanding the situation, but towards what happens, I would need a crystal ball. And I'm afraid I've left that at home, but I think one thing that is important to remember is, you know, there are actors in international politics that are rational and that actors that are irrational, and that will go to any length for an ideological reason. Putin is, I think, a rational actor, but he is also someone who knows that when he will lose power, he will probably also lose his life. So he cannot afford to lose power. He cannot afford to go quietly, and he will probably prefer a war to losing an election.
No es muy alentador.
This is not very encouraging, Máriam. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to share this conversation with you, with such a nice company. The truth is that the question is very complex. I think that we need to imagine several scenarios, but I think that the crisis in Ukraine is bringing about many things, among which the weaknesses of the structures within the European Union. Also, it's presenting different options within our world. It's highlighting other type of cuts that has to do with the Anglosphere and with the old continent. This we could see with the Brexit and the rupture. We saw in a dramatic way how Berlin and Paris were becoming apart. We have seen also with the discussions between Macron and Boris Johnson, and also with the signature of the Locus Treaty that has expelled France and has brought as geostrategic partners Australia, Great Britain, and the United States. And it has left us aside and pushed us away and created a sort of a fracture within the Western world. And the Ukrainian crisis, I believe, has brought us or made us be aware of the fact that Western can act as a single unit, because at the same time that we see the Western be split, we see a new bloc arising or coming up with China and Russia, who want the world to be more and more like their own vision of the world. And I believe that there are two big challenges at the moment. First of all, there's a challenge of the universality or the alleged universality of an ideal and a model that wanted us to think that all countries would come together in a model such as ours, and also the human aspects that does not belong to the United Nations, and all the structures that were brought about after the Second World War. It has come to our knowledge that this was only thought to strengthen the power of the Western world, and we need to rethink all these values. And at the same time, we might be at risk of thinking that the human values and the human rights are simply a Western country type of vision of the world. And also, we can think that there's a single pole, there's a new axe between China and Russia that will determine and that is changing the vision that we have of democracy, and it's also leaving the Western countries out of the game and out of the central spots that we used to have at a given time. And it's a war that is bringing about all these elements. And what's going to happen, I really cannot tell, but I think there are so many elements that we can learn from, some lessons to be learned about the way we see Europe, our future, and our safety structures, and how we want to think about this Europe of the defense, the way that we want to look at the world from this umbrella related to the NATO. And all these elements at the time are at play, and they bring about all the structural weaknesses. And I think this is a very interesting time to think about all these.
Esto porque ha dejado.
I don't know what Philipp is thinking about all this, because Máriam has brought about two questions. First of all, the health of the European Union, this project that came about from the ruins of the Second World War, will survive, or if our children will have to rethink all these structures, or they will have to reformulate this.
I think we are living in Europe especially in a very interesting time, because we are still living in a model that worked very, very well for the post-war era. But it is a model of the post-war era, and it is actually no longer adapted to the challenges that we have today. That extends to our democratic models, but that also extends to, for instance, the European Union, which was founded out of distrust of the populations of European countries. It's a union at state level. It's not a union of peoples. We don't have direct elections for a European Parliament. We elect national parties who then talk to each other to find a platform that nobody voted for. It is not a very democratic structure. The European Parliament doesn't have legislative initiative and can't push forward new developments. So I think the European Union really needs to be refounded. Because we need a mechanism that is more powerful, more international than nation states. And nation states may have become obsolete, but this European Union, I don't think, can function also in an international context and with the strategic challenges of an international context, because some historian, I forget who, has said that the end of the Cold War was also the return of history. And that's a very interesting formulation, because not so much in Spain, you've had a lot of history in the 1970s, but in many European countries, history was the great developments of histories, and certainly such symptoms of history as wars were far away. That happened somewhere else. And Europe was stable, democratic, liberal, wealthy. It thought it had discovered a new model of being for societies. And we learn now that history has come back, the threat of war has come back, not only in Ukraine. We've had wars in Yugoslavia, we've had wars in many places, and of course Europe and the West is constantly involved in wars, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other places in the world. So we have a union that has nothing to offer in situations like that. Because if there's a strategic challenge, it doesn't help for European institutions to consult for 3 years about what might be done and how it could be worded. You need action. You need the possibility. Barack Obama, when he was elected, had said, what number do I ring if I want to call Europe? And you need someone to talk to, and you need someone to talk to who actually has the authority and the possibility of doing something about this, and not just going to say, let me go back to my friends and in a few years we might be able to come up with a negotiated solution. So I think this union is important as a project for us. I see us as Europeans, or indeed as citizens of the world, but it is no longer able to deliver what this historical situation actually demands.
Pues yo disiento un poco.
I have to dissent somewhat.
Porque
because I believe that it's the most unheard of experiment that humanity has created in its history, that 27 countries can come together and agree, for instance, to distribute and buy the vaccine, and that they start to give the shots at the same day, and having some vulnerability criteria. I don't think that we have seen this anywhere else in the planet. And I think that Europe has learned a lot from the crisis that we had 10 years ago. Also, the European funds are a solitary response to this that happened 10 years ago, and Europe cannot respond to a crisis the way we did 10 years ago. And this way of responding to this crisis in such a solitary way, which has been a crisis that has been unique and that has touched the whole world. And I'm talking about this because you were talking about mistrust and about what is now the European Union comes about due to the mistrust of many countries, and right now it has been able to get over a crisis not from this state of mistrust but trusting each other instead, and being aware that we make a political community, that we need to have a shared future, a shared destiny, and having a war by very near us. Europe doesn't feel comfortable talking the language of power, but this language is the one that is ruling the world. Europe needs to learn to talk this language, to speak this language, but they need to find also their own strengths. For instance, to lead in certain policies about, for instance, the decarbonization of economy or climate change, where the European Union can be a true leader, because there's something very interesting that we need to see happening, this that is so unavoidable, that is climate change. And also we need to prevent the citizens from having a reaction against the dramatic measures that sometimes will need to be taken, and we need to place in the core of it all the social justice. And only the Western democracies and the European democracies are actually the only ones that are ready to do such a thing, and they have the will to do such a thing. It is true that is not as democratic as we would like it to be, but at some point, or to a certain extent, it's learning from its mistakes. And this community that brings about 27 countries, and that is like a machinery where we see the institutions on the one hand, on the other hand we see the member states, and then we see the political families. All these elements need to be lubricated in a way that they can reach consensus, and this is something very authentic, and I think it deserves to be defended. And it's complicated to convey our idea of democracy from the idea of a nation state to a supranational concept that obviously has many dark areas still. There are overlappings in certain functions. We saw these days, for instance, with Mr. Borrell. We didn't know if it was Macron who had to speak directly with Russia. Borrell was really concerned because he's dealing with the United States, and then Macron comes up with a different idea, and then we have von der Leyen at the same time through the NATO. And it's true that sometimes we see these confusions, but that beautiful book of Bauman's, where he talks about the European Union as an adventure, maybe reminiscing on the trips of Ulysses in the Mediterranean Sea, where you never see that the goal is to close a project, but the project itself is the way, and that we need to understand Europe as an unfinished project, as an ongoing work, and we need to be pedagogical about this, and we need to think that we are looking in the right direction at the moment.
Well, you just I mean, we don't want to discuss about the European Union all night, but just two little points. I think the COVID pandemic showed us very well how problematic it is, because as soon as COVID came, there were only national states. There was no Europe. There was COVID in Spain, there was COVID in Italy, there was COVID in Germany. Every state had different regimes, every state had different solutions. There was no European vaccine program, there was no European response. In fact, I think there was also a symbolic failure at the beginning of the pandemic, that there was no European response, Europe was not part of the whole discussion. It simply didn't happen. And yes, I think those discussions are very important, but we also know that there are many, many more lobbyists than politicians in Brussels. And they've got much, much more money to spend. And also, Zygmunt Bauman, the divorce between politics and power that has also happened in Europe, where we find that elected politicians are simply no longer able to make the kind of decisions that the CEOs of great companies can make about the futures of workforces, the futures of industries, the futures of, what a state takes in tax revenue and can redistribute. So I think I take your point that it is a beautiful adventure and that an adventure that we need to make. I personally think we would only become real Europeans if we felt like Europeans. And that means, I would think it would be a wild idea, but let me throw it out here, if we had not military service, but a European social year. Every young European man and woman spends 1 year in a different country that doesn't speak his language and does some work there. And that's, I think, how you could have people who feel themselves as Europeans and begin to see this is a living reality, not just a bureaucratic apparatus.
¿Quieres apelar algo?
Would you like to reply, or shall we move forward? Well, the thing is, I share the idea that power and politics are more and more separated, and we talked about this morning. But at the same time, I need to insist that the pandemic has actually shown that there could be a political will and that the policies can be independent and that important decisions can be made and right decisions can be made. And it's true that there are many lobbies and politics is more and is narrower every day, but at the same time I think the pandemic has strengthened the role of the states, and at least it has made us aware of the importance of the things that the politics give us and the state give us beyond the systemic works that we have seen through the pandemic. We have also seen the power of the state, that the power of the state, because they've been strong enough to bring about a lockdown, and all of a sudden
Sí, los estados nacionales.
Yes, the national states, but at the same time we have seen that there have been many decisions that have been made at a transnational level, like the European funds or the vaccines themselves. And I don't know, I think that the pandemic has shown that there is this political will. Máriam is trying to bring us to a more optimistic side of the history, because you sustain that fewer and fewer people believe in the fiction of democracy. You're comparing the current times with what happened after 1918, with the rise of the totalitarianisms. And I would like to listen to you both, connecting to what you were both saying. Is there the risk that the best times for the liberal democracies has already passed?
I think we are living in a profound crisis of liberalism. Liberalism in the widest sense of the word, not in a party political sense. And that is for two reasons, I think. First of all, liberalism is no longer the only kid on the block. During the Cold War, it was very easy to decide whether liberalism was a good idea or not. You just had to see how people lived on either side of the Iron Curtain. On the one side they were poor and oppressed, on the other side they were fairly free and very wealthy. And so it wasn't very difficult to choose sides. Now this has changed, because I think also the impact of economics on politics that has been so much stronger in recent years We have seen European states turn away from liberalism quite democratically. Hungary and Poland elected anti-liberal governments in completely democratic elections. We have seen China, that is fantastically successful in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's a great achievement, and they're not interested in liberalism, and in fact most Chinese people support that and say we don't want that. We've got far lower crime rates than in the West, which is true. We've got social peace here, thank you, which is true. So all of a sudden there are alternative models, and if you want to choose for liberalism, it may cost you something. It's no longer automatically what gives you wealth and freedom. And the second reason is that I think the liberal project itself has been tarnished. When I went to school, I still heard, to make a caricature of it, liberalism, we are rich and peaceful because we are punctual, we work hard, we're not corrupt, we have transparency, we are democratic, and that's why Europe has become rich. There wasn't a word of, we have been robbing the rest of the world blind for 400 years. We have enslaved tens of thousands of people to make Europe rich. We have destroyed natural habitats and environments at an unprecedented level in order to reach this level of wealth in liberal societies. And all of a sudden, the liberal project no longer looks so shiny. And it has become a much more complicated idea in this new world to decide whether this is the society you want to live in, this is the only and best model of society. It may still be the best model of society, but you need a lot more arguments now to make your case, I think.
Well, I think that we are in a discussion that has to do with the enemies, the external and internal enemies of liberalism. There was the issue of pride. We were talking about what was more harming to democracy, and we talked about the pride of liberalism. The crisis that democracies are enduring at the moment have had to do with two elements. Maybe populism has been a reaction to the pride of liberalism. On the one hand, that liberalism needs to be refounded, and being aware of this pride that characterizes it. But on the other hand, I think it needs to reestablish itself in the face of what's going on in the world. That liberalism crisis has to do with the Western crisis and with the appearance of other models that, as you say, are actually challenging our ideas of democracy. When we break that virtuous alliance that has to do with a market economy based on fundamental rights and the advancement of societies, and we see that other societies are actually progressing further than ours, and that the inequalities are decreasing in those countries, whereas in ours it's increasing. All this virtuous cycle is broken, and what the democracy has is just the norms on which it's based. But I think that in your last book, when you talked about the fragile identity, referring to liberalism, I think that this fragility is all at the same time its strength. It's hard to defend it because it doesn't give us the certainties that the authoritarianism gives us. It doesn't give us a strong identity, and it doesn't bring us answers. It doesn't give us a narrative that is consistent within itself, such as Trump's narrative that, all the words he said were consistent with each other, and they hosted this idea of America first, and this involved building a taller wall and protecting the Pittsburgh citizens in the face of the Treaty of Paris, and the international game for him had to amount to zero, and all this was consistent within itself and protected the people within the system. But liberalism is not like that. It's fragile in that sense, but at the same time it's important to that being aware of its arrogance, we still protect it and defend it, and we see all these flaws that have brought about the emergence of populisms.
Fragility of liberalism, because I think that's a very important point. Also the fragility of democracy. Not in Spain, but in most other European countries, Western European countries, we sort of take democracy as the default case. We've only ever known democracy. And that obscures the fact that democracies are, to put it very bluntly, they were piggybacking on the oil boom, on the boom of fossil fuels. Democracies are emerged in Europe as European countries were in a huge economic boom after the Second World War. And the old promise in a democracy, your children will have it better than you, was actually true. Because, countries were getting richer. And in this surge of optimism, most democracies really formed. If you think of, here's a little criterion for real democracy, when did women get the vote? Well, in France it was 1945. In Switzerland it was 1972. We haven't been real democracies for a very long time. Democracies are a very young phenomenon. They're a complete exception in history. People always say, oh yes, but there was the Attic democracies of Athens and so. But they were democracies of about 8,000 free men. Not of women, not of slaves, not of common folk. That wasn't a democracy in our sense. Democracy in the full sense is really, in most countries, not much older than the Second World War. And it is a function of increasing wealth, and that is also built in its model. And we are now living in a time when, first of all, this kind of capitalism has reached a stage of maturity where increasing wealth is very difficult to realize. We're sort of living in a fata morgana of increasing wealth, because the wealth goes into the pockets of Bill Gates and Apple and Elon Musk, but we normal folk don't see. They got twice as rich during COVID. We sort of didn't. So, there's an imbalance between these things. It is no longer the promise that we can grow. And then comes the climate catastrophe. And, our model of economic growth. Let's put it this way. I think the little statistics says everything. If we want 3% of economic growth, and we need economic growth in the current system, that means that every economy will have to double in size every 24 years. That's the miracle of compound interest. And how is that supposed to be? Can you imagine to live in a Spain in 24 years' time where there's twice the amount of products created with twice the amount of resources and creating twice as much rubbish? There is no sustainable technology that can magic that away. It is simply not a model that we will be able to pursue. And then, of course, we get the very exciting question, so if that doesn't work, what can work?
Quiero contarte una cosa.
I would like to tell you something. Máriam Martínez Bascuñán is the co-author with Fernando Vallespín of the book called Populism, and it talks about the democracy and the rights of. It's a quote by you. That democracy and the rights of men are an exception and maybe a mere episode. You were talking about climate change with that warning that leaves us this sentence. Why are we so late at arriving at these conclusions? Why are we so late in this changing the climate change?
Why are we so late? It's quite easy. We have it fabulous. we're richer than our parents were, and they were richer than their parents were. We live in peaceful times. We can, and why are we living in peaceful times? Because basically we've learned something very clever. We have used globalization to export all the violence and all the pollution to other places. The stuff we wear, the stuff we consume is produced at horrendous environmental costs somewhere else. So when we import it, we are nice and clean. The violent aspects of keeping us safe are conducted somewhere else, not in Europe. And that's, I think, where we have a curious sort of political mirage here, that things are safe and stable and growing. And it is very difficult to get people who live in a model that seems to work, and also in a kind of capitalism. I think it's boring to just condemn capitalism. But in this particular kind of hyper-capitalism, where people are kept anxious and afraid all the time, you dangle a big carrot of expensive stuff that you can buy and exotic things that you can participate in, but in order to do that you have to, this brilliant little book of Etienne de la Boétie, a philosopher in the 16th century, La servitude volontaire, voluntary slavery. And he describes that people subject themselves to power out of their own will, and that power in fact consists only in what other people think of the powerful person. And if a king gives an order, or a dictator, and everybody says, I'm not going to do that, then he's just going to be a ridiculous little person with a comb over. He's no longer going to be a person of great authority. But in order to participate in this rather relentless race to economic success, we have to make ourselves voluntary slaves of this system, and we have to keep adapting, and we have to keep getting additional qualifications, and we have to be ready at the drop of a hat to work in a different city and to move our whole family, and the market dictates and we obey. And that is quite a fragile situation, and I think that also means that, first of all, that liberalism is compromised, also that the sort of humanist vision that you said so beautifully Europe was based on is very heavily compromised, because that's no longer the vision our societies actually pursue in many ways. And so, why are these democracies fragile? I think there are many reasons, but it comes down to the fact that we really need a systemic reset. And these systemic resets are always very difficult, because every revolution is started by idealists and ended by bandits. And so, you have a system that is massively dysfunctional, very unjust, but also delivers great goods to a lot of people. And it is very difficult to dismantle that, especially in societies where consumption has become the central right we have, and also the central way of expressing our identities. I think it's very important in a society that people are readable. When you are introduced to someone, you see that person and you hear his or her name, you immediately have a story for that person. If that person has an African or an Asian name, you find it very difficult to make a story and to read that person, and perhaps to learn to trust that person. And consumption gives us mechanisms for making us readable. I can be a punk, or I can be a Ralph Lauren guy, or I can be a Chanel girl, and people can read me, and they know about my social aspirations, they know where to put me. So to dismantle that process and say we need to live in a world with much less consumption, because we simply can't produce all this stuff anymore, that also raises the question, okay, if we do that, fine, but what are we then? Who are we then? If we no longer can define ourselves by what we consume and how. And frankly, I don't know the answer to that.
Máriam?
Yes, it's extremely interesting. I think that there is a battle of ideas that we will need to activate. I was thinking that if the climate regime, the new awareness of the climate regime will also challenge, or should challenge, the promise regime, the way we relate ourselves with democracy through promises, and come out from that dialectic of accelerating the promises and then to be so disappointed when these promises are not delivery. I think that this is a condition that it needs to be fulfilled so we can come out of the process, because this dialectic seems to be more related with romance of the individuals, as if we need to test every day if we needed everyday approval of love. And I wonder if this new climate regime will also change the way we relate with our expectations towards the promises from democracy, and change these promises towards the future.
No sé si quieres decir algo, Philipp.
I don't know if you want to say something.
Pregunto yo,
No, I think you continue to do it.
Sí, fíjate,
I think that we were talking about a climate emergence, but green parties are not very strong. At least in Europe, they're not very strong. Maybe Germany is an exception. The Green Party just entered the three-party coalition. How do you explain the situation?
Look, to give you the real answer, and the historian's answer, is that we have got in our bones and our bloodstream the idea that we are here to subjugate the earth, to be the boss of the earth. We are not part of nature, we are above nature. The Bible has told that to people, and before the Bible other myths have told that to people, and we have grown up with that. It is in our most intimate understanding of ourselves that we are not part of nature. We are not like other animals. We can, keep other animals in appalling conditions, and because we like serrano ham or whatever it may be, we are outside of nature. I think I'm not known for great optimist statements, but here's a bit of optimism. We are living, or that's actually not such an optimistic statement. There's a Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times." And we live in the most interesting of times. The times are absolutely fascinating because, first of all, there are various disasters around the corner, but also we are living at the time when this idea that is 6,000 years old is dying around us. With the climate emergency, we can no longer pretend that we stand outside of nature. With COVID, we saw how vulnerable we are and how natural we are, and that one stupid little virus, just a little chain of RNA, can stop the world's most powerful economies in the matter of days. So we are learning all of a sudden that we are part of nature, and that we are not so exceptional as we like to think, and that we are a very unimportant part of a vast system. Plankton or mushrooms or ants are far more important to nature than human beings are. But this is a huge process psychologically. You're asking people to accept that they're not who they thought they were, that they have to give up the mechanism by which they bought their identity, that their countries and their virtues are not what they thought they were. And I think that is a lot to swallow for one generation. Usually these things take a few generations, but now it has to happen almost at once. I think the psychological resistance against this is very, very big. And to allow yourself to see yourself as part of the system of nature, as one animal among others, as very vulnerable to changes. We just had the debate with Peter Sloterdijk. Peter Sloterdijk has worked together a lot with a French philosopher called Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour, we spoke about that earlier this morning, he's made made a very, I think, quite a beautiful and poetic remark. He said, we should stop thinking ourselves as living on Earth. Because living on Earth gives us the image that we've got the feet in the dirt and the head high above in the clean air with a great horizon above it all. And that's the wrong image to have in our heads. We should think that we live in the critical zone. And the critical zone is the tiny membrane of gas that surrounds this planet, and in which there are millions and billions of different acting entities, from bacteria to ocean liners, and from plankton to people. And all of them modify this critical zone. And we are dependent to some degree on all of them and what they do, and that they function well in order to allow our survival. Now that is a radical rethinking of the human condition. And I don't think people are really willing to do that without having to do it, without being forced to do it by circumstance. Not by governments, but by circumstance. And you know, there is a school of history that says people only learn through catastrophes. It may not be through catastrophes, but I think through vast systemic change, yes. As long as the system works more or less, even with dysfunctional as it may be, people will stick with it. Because after all, it works more or less. Why would we change it? Only if it breaks down completely is the motivation really of a whole society to change. But that, of course, is also a very dangerous moment. Because then there come the people, your people, the populists, with the simple answers. Who say, you know, yeah, these green idiots, they talk about the climate, but it's actually the people with the dark skin who live in your city. And if you throw them out, the world will be fine. We built a nice big wall around our country. Nobody will get in. All these bad things will stay outside. So the moment when a system begins to change and to break down is also the moment, of course, when the worst energies in a society can gain the ascendancy and can gain power. It's a moment where you have to be very vigilant. But I think that is a moment we're moving towards. The good news is we could also all get our courage up and our imagination up and create actually better societies. Societies that are not forcing us to work in a way, in a market, in a system that is actually not satisfying our needs. So I think it is philosophically a hugely exciting moment to be alive, because it really requires a rethink of our condition, of who we are and how we want to live together. But it's also a very dangerous moment, and I can understand personally very well why people are reluctant to engage with it. Because life's hard enough. But we will have to engage with it, and we will have to engage with it very soon.
Máriam, dime que tú no piensas que somos tan...
Máriam, tell me that you don't think that we are so naive and that we are in the phase of a narrative that is breaking apart. Well, I think it's wonderful what Philipp just said, that we are in this point of ambivalence where at the same time it's a moment that is full of energy, philosophically very exciting, where we need to go to the root of the key questions, to the basics, to what we are. I think that is fascinating. And on the other hand, it's there, and we are late. I think this ambivalence is very well reflected, and I think that we see this also in the elections that have taken place in Germany. You said, Lara, that the Green Party is a party that in the end fell down in the surveys and also in the polls. But at the same time, we think the climate change was one of the main topics and one of the main concerns when it came to voting by the majority of the German people. And I think this is almost a miracle. I don't know if this could happen also in Spain. Maybe, well, we were talking before that the Minister of Health yesterday was pushing his idea of liberty at Parliament. And obviously this does not happen here in Spain. And I don't think we need to see this green mindset in the Green Party only, but also see it in a horizontal way, in a cross-sectional way. There are many proposals coming to the European Parliament that have to do with green aspects. Von der Leyen is seen as an activist from Greenpeace by many, but at the same time the European Union is based the Next Generation program in that idea, in the decarbonization of economy. And I think this is a key item for Europe, and I think this is a big success. We go back to the European Union when we think of these student movements, this energy that they are conveying to the different populations. I think that Caroline Emenke said this in an article that she wrote after the German elections, when everyone was focused in the defeat of the CDU after the Merkel era. And she talked about there's no place for negationism. This was one of the main concerns for the population, that it will be a main concern for the government in Germany, and that it's also very important for the European Union, and that there is no more place for this negationism. And despite all the discussions that are going on about the meat industry here in Spain, I think that despite this is a very interesting moment, and I wouldn't be pessimistic about this.
No, es que no sé si Philipp quiere contestar.
I don't know if Philipp would like to answer to what you have just said, or if you would like to say something more. Well, I was listening to you, and I was thinking that everything is related. The populism, the climate change. Populists are denying climate change, and Philipp was talking about charlatans that could fill the voids when something is breaking apart, or when we are at the end of an era. Who are the most dangerous charlatans at this moment?
The most dangerous charlatans? Oh, that's an interesting question. First of all, I think let's not use as the first answer the politicians, because it's very easy to bash politicians. But what politicians do, and this is partly a good thing, they're thinking of politics as part of a normal career. And that is simply a consequence of democratization. You know, the politicians used to be either ideologically completely convinced and willing to make sacrifices, or they were patricians who didn't really need to make money and didn't really need to be corrupt in politics. And today, you know, normal people go into politics and they think 10 years in politics is great, and then I've filled my address book with lots of interesting numbers I can call, and then I can have a great career in the economy. As a consultant or something. But, you know, it's up to us to change that. It's up to us to say, if a party doesn't have a really solid program of how to deal with the climate catastrophe, it's not an interesting party. It's not a party we can vote for. It doesn't matter where it stands in the political spectrum. Yeah, I was having that discussion with a socialist minister in Austria not so long ago. And, you know, they had all sorts of ideas how to deal with the labor market and how to change things. And I asked them about, you know, what about the climate crisis? Yes, we will have to do something about that as well. And that is clearly not enough. So, you know, I think it is up to us as voters to decide that we hold their feet to the fire, and that we say, this is our central concern now. We know that nothing good can happen unless we address this problem. And if you have nothing to say to that, you have nothing to say. So that would be my first answer. I think charlatans, you know, yes, a lot of populist politicians are charlatans. They've actually got no solutions, and they've just got emotional solutions. But I think not so much the charlatans, what worries me more is the manipulators. who are very successful in framing the debates we have, for instance, about the climate catastrophe. The carbon footprint was invented by BP, British Petroleum, because it concentrates people beautiful on what they do themselves and makes them nice and neurotic about how much they fly and should they use their car or not. And when you're so preoccupied with yourself, you no longer look at big systemic change, was the thinking behind this. So it's individualized the problem. It's made it a consumer level problem. And it's not a consumer level problem. If in Europe everybody begins to be vegan tomorrow and no longer uses a car, it will do nothing to the climate catastrophe, because that's being decided in Asia. And unless we engage politically with Asian countries on how to limit the climate crisis, unless we engage with Brazil, which is at the moment, and I have researched this number carefully, at the moment 30 football fields size of rainforest is destroyed every minute. 30 football fields every minute. We can be vegan as long as we want, as long as things like that go on. So the real solutions are at a different level. Yes, we must change our lives. Yes, we must adapt in these ways. And that's only sensible, and our lives won't be worse for it. They'll just be different. But this does not solve the climate crisis. And that is a masterstroke in framing that industrial think tanks have imposed on the debate. Also the idea that, the Green Revolution is something that is invented by spoil sports who just want to forbid us things that are fun. We like to do things and they say you're no longer allowed to do that, that's bad for the environment. And the transformation is only about spoiling people's fun and making life rigid and rule-oriented and boring. And what a masterstroke of framing that is. I've compared that this morning to, I don't know how many of you have children. But, from that perspective, that's a terribly stupid thing to do. You are poorer because you have children by about 100,000 euros at least per child. You probably couldn't travel as much, you couldn't socialize as much, your sex may not have been as good, you may have ended up divorced. That's so much sacrifice for what? Deciding for something much more important, a family, a future. So if we can start thinking in the climate debate about what we decide for and not what we decide against, not what we forbid, but what we empower, what we make possible, I think the debate will go into a completely different direction. And so I think the charlatans today that are most important are the charlatans that keep us entertained, the charlatans that keep us distracted from the real problems, and the charlatans that hold the key to the debate.
Máriam?
I fully agree. The easy argument is always to talk about politicians, and I also believe, or I want to believe, that we might be at a moment where we're seeing the end of frivolity, and this could be represented by the fall of the greatest of charlatans, who is Boris Johnson, who has been the product of that populist era himself and Donald Trump. And at this time, one of them has disappeared, although he's latent, and let's see what happens in 2024, because if he manages to win the elections in 2024, probably the United States stops being a democracy. This might be a very strong statement, but I truly believe so. But I think that the pandemic has opened that window of opportunity so that we can end the frivolity in politics, and that I believe that Johnson will be the victim of his own frivolity, that he's embodying the fall of frivolity in politics. But at the same time, I believe that there is a problem within democracies, and I think that we can see this here. I don't know how I can phrase this. I think that there could be a certain misplacement of the political actors who are playing politics, but maybe they should be in another board, on another board. I see a parliament that is pretending to be a TV studio, and I see TV studios who are trying to, or are acting as parliaments, and I see writers in newspapers who are playing to make politics, and politicians who are trying to build opinion among the population. So I see that there's a sort of a colonization of different spaces within democratic countries, and I think this should be in their own spaces, and that right now they are being distorted, and this is damaging for democracy. And I think that this is something that we should think about. We have very little time, and I don't know if somebody in the audience may want to ask a question. Please speak now or hold your peace. I see that there's a question there.
And there.
Sí, ha sido muy interesante.
Well, it has been very, very interesting, but the point is that we are all very worried, I would say, because in some way I think that it has been really realistic, that is very useful to wake us up. But it's very possible that when we walk out the door, we go back to our daily concerns, and that's my concern indeed, that we'll live in a model of society where both politics and culture play a coaching role, I would say, that they try not to speak about the negative issues except when these statements have a real impact and they sell, so to speak. So, I mean, this is one of the topics that is able to create an impact in the marketing, in the commercial world, that it has got into that world where the ideas are sold and bought, of course. And I see this in the character of Gumberg, the young Swedish lady that has become into some kind of fetish. She is seeing every kind of comments, remarks on the social media, but that's useful to hide a much more serious discussion about the problems. But I don't want to get in this. I think that you've talked about the main problem at the beginning. The main problem is that the only solution is that we turn our mindset around totally. And maybe the productive structure too, etc. But what I think that is more difficult is how to change the identity. I mean, this is a problem that we face in the Western world, because the Western identity is always necessarily linked to an idea according to which, this is the idea of progress. I mean, can we live refusing progress at that element that is bringing us to the future? Or maybe in an opposite way, our immediate present will be about defending ourselves in front of that future. This is what is starting to appear right now, I would say. And I think that we need to make an important effort there, an effort that requires us to have intellectual leadership. I really don't see it. Political leadership too. And a pressure downside up that is able to, for example, the example of Brazil has been very, very clear. The kind of activities that are causing the situation that we live in. So I think that This is not an academic discussion anymore. I think that we should resist to, should we be reluctant to put this into daily politics? I mean, I think that we are facing a really civilization challenge. Professor Blom has said that somebody has to tell people that tomorrow could not be better than today. Nobody has never said that. I was really impressed when I saw that poster with the children from Liceos schools were there that said, we want to live as our parents, because they were anticipating the possibility that this idea of progress that we take for granted was not going to be possible anymore. But we don't have to make a negative reading. We need to convince them that we either live worse than our parents or we won't have any future. Sorry, I've been beating around the bush a lot.
I don't know if someone wants to answer very briefly.
Please. I think it's important to realize from where we inherited the idea of progress, and that's from Catholic theology. The idea of history going towards an end, that is a resolution of all the problems, where there will be a judgment, where there will be afterwards a place of happiness and everlasting peace. That's a Christian idea. And it came through socialism, it came into the political discourse, but there's a wonderful Indian intellectual and historian, Pankaj Mishra, who has described progress as much more of a double-edged sword. And again, we have experienced the developments of the last decades as progress because we've kept the good bits for ourselves and we've exported the phenomenal violence that has been created by that. The progress always brings change and always brings quite brutal change. And the 2 world wars were certainly in part a result of the progress the Industrial Revolution had made, that had uprooted millions of people's identities, that had created great insecurity, that had created enormous violence. And indeed the wars were partly also a sort of cathartic moment of enacting that violence. But we have managed to export this violence, and I think if we can perhaps step back from the idea of progress a bit more and see that every change is ambivalent, which doesn't mean that no change is an option, and which doesn't mean that return to an idyllic past is an option. But at the same time, this idea that progress is that change is only positive, and that we are going towards some kind of New Jerusalem is a religious idea. And I think as self-respecting secularists, we should probably not just fall for that because it's been presented to us as the truth. Perhaps we should look a little bit more what different effects progress has on the environment, on poorer people in other countries, our progress. And then I think we will see that it's a much more ambivalent historical phenomenon. And also, it is undeniable that civilizations grow and die and fall. And they have always done that. And why should ours be an exception? We live at the end of the great power of the West. And what we have in Europe, the anger is also partly, the anger of wealthy white people who are no longer calling the shots, whose word is no longer accepted as gospel. And partly we think, how dare they? But it is a moment of such ambivalence that we live in, that, the idea of progress becomes much more shimmering and shining and much more difficult to catch, and perhaps much less of an ultimate ambition. I mean, yes, a step back from consumerism would be progress in the perspective of some people, but for other people it would be a very bad thing. So all of a sudden progress becomes contested territory.
No sé si Máriam.
I don't know if Máriam would like to add something, but I would like to insist on her being very brief. I will just want to add something very pessimistic. Well, then let's wrap it up now. There's another question. Please be very brief. We are out of time. It's a question for Mr. Blom. Is there anything that we can do as individuals? Because if I understood it well, you said that if all Europeans would become vegan tomorrow and stopped using our cars, that would not help in any way towards solving climate change. So as individuals, what can we do? Personally, I'm a vegan, but...
Question, hopefully short answer. Of course it is necessary that we do these things, if only to be in a negotiating position with other countries, with other economies. We can't keep using energy as we do and say, oh, but you have to do everything different. There also comes a post-colonial dimension into that discussion, that they say, you've managed to become very wealthy and now you want to prevent us from becoming wealthy. But what can we do individually? Yes, eat less meat. Yes, look how much energy you use and all that, but also dare to think more courageously. Dare to go into the future with courage and with a positive utopian energy and think, we can change. This is possible. And this is not just a catastrophe, this is a chance to develop actually a better kind of society. And I think if we can get more imagination and more courage into our societies, we'll already be a long step ahead. But even if the great changes are systemic and above national level, individual change, we are all individuals and it all begins at the level of individuals, and we have reason to be optimistic and robust and hopeful going into a future trying to create something better.
Tenemos motivos para...
We have reasons to be optimistic. That's the last sentence he said at this meeting today. And I would like to offer some light as well, citing a quote from Gramsci. The pessimism of reason and optimism of will. Thank you very much to Foro de la Cultura for organizing this event. Thank you, Fundación Telefónica, for hosting this event included in the initiative Rethinking Tomorrow. And thank you, of course, to the two speakers today, great professors, Máriam Martínez Bascuñán and Philipp Blom. Thank you.
Good.